My name is Kavita Patel. I'm the director of the policy program at Stanford's Byers Center for Biodesign. And I had been hoping to put up a little slideshow that kind of gave a little preview of biodesign and just what we're going to cover today, but I'm going to do it verbally since I did not have the technical wherewithal to do so. So we get to be pretty flexible and adaptive. For those of you that are watching the recorded session, maybe I can figure out a way to sneak it in. But wanted to thank, we were trying in this policy program to tackle some of the issues that for those of us who have spent a significant time on healthcare policy, which are all of my amazing panelists, we spend much of our time trying to understand, I think, the intersections of like the public sector, the private sector, trying to think about some of what goes into the consideration for a topic like drug pricing, drug supplies, drug demand, and then what really matters. And I would say that all of us, I think I can speak pretty firmly, knowing each of the panelists, that I think at the end of the road, all of us want to make sure it actually hits where it matters, and which is our patients and their lives. So as we talk about these policy issues, we wanted this webinar series to really help provoke multiple kind of points of view, but also offer perspectives that sometimes do not come to light. And I do think that sometimes in these health policy discussions, people forget about the fact that we still have, 1 in 5 Americans who struggle with actually being able to pay for their medications, and then 3 in 5 Americans who state that price is a consideration when they are kind of getting their refills, adhering to their regimens. And then in general, just thinking about the role of the United States in drug pricing, as well as the role of the United States and kind of our global R&D, research and development impact from innovation. I can just say this firsthand as a clinician. I think all of us would say that when I started medical school, which feels like it was during the Jurassic Park era, but it wasn't that long ago. But when I was in medical school, the field of hematology oncology, for example, was pretty simple. There were not that many drugs to give. If you went onto the bone marrow transplant unit, which I would have to work kind of swing shifts in, it was just a matter of days before you waited for people to get an infection and die. And now I can truly say that between triple negative breast cancer therapy, having someone with advanced stage lung cancer, that we have options. And the fact that I can say that and say that to a patient or have a follow-up with a patient who has gone through kind of therapies is nothing short of miraculous. So I don't want to overlook the fact that we've made an incredible amount of progress with some of these same innovations in a matter of decades. So who do we have joining us? When trying to think about getting a wide range of perspectives, wanted to actually bring together some of the very different forces that understand more and more about the complicated topics I've talked about: drug pricing, drug costs, drug supply, drug demand. So we'll start with a friend, Allan Coukell. All of these panelists, I guess this is my prerogative. I get to have people on that I actually know and like, and that's something that is rare in Washington, D.C. to say, but all people I admired for their professional accomplishments. Allan Coukell, he's currently the Senior Vice President at Civica. He's going to tell us a little bit, for those of you who do not know what Civica is, will tell us a little bit about that. He's a clinical pharmacist and has an incredible history also at Pew Charitable Trust and an organization I hold near and dear to my heart, Community Catalyst, along with also spending time not just as a clinical pharmacist in oncology, but as a science journalist. Next, we have Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, and she also has had an incredible policy career. Recently is the president and CEO of BIO, or what's called the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, the world's largest biotech advocacy group, and has had to sit and kind of wrestle with this global perspective. And I think there's a great quote that Michelle offers. She has an incredibly diverse background as well, having worked at J&J and a number of like kind of key like science policy roles at the National Science Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. But I'm going to end Michelle's introduction with a quote that I think just brings it all together. She calls the distribution of scientific process. Sorry, I'm going to start over. She calls the distribution of scientific progress the social justice issue of our age, and I think that's very eloquently put. And then rounding out, another friend, an incredible incredible, not just academician, but like pragmatic thinker, Dr. Kevin Schulman, who is a professor of medicine at the Clinical Excellence Research Center, CERC at Stanford, and also has a number of kind of courtesy appointments, which in Stanford speak means that he has kind of exceeded the threshold where other schools want to make sure that he is affiliated with them because they know it's an asset. He's a health economist, health services researcher, and an internist, and really does kind of function at the intersection of these kind of public and private domains, and has had a number of publications. What kind of brings him to this stage is really his research, ongoing research, looking at a number of different aspects of drug supply chain, looking at pharmaceutical benefit management companies, and also thinking about the complicated issues of drug pricing. So with that, I am going to start and try to kick it off. I did want to, we're going to keep to time, but we want to make sure, and I'm going to actually ask Michelle, I'm going to have Michelle, Allan, and Kevin, I'm using their first names because I know them, but I'm going to ask each of you to kind of react to a different question. And Michelle, I do want to touch on that great kind of quote around the distribution of scientific progress as a social, I can't say progress, distribution of scientific progress as a social justice issue. Let's be candid about where we are on this journey to progress. And then maybe before you answer that, I think there are a number of people, if they haven't been paying close attention to Medicare's price negotiations and what's happening, as well as what's also happening from the Biden administration and the FDA and the White House on supply chain. And then I know that you all too well understand the tension that kind of some legislative action might have on some of what we just talked about. Where are we really on this journey to progress as we think about it? Michelle.
Well, it's such a great question. First of all, thanks for having me, Kavita. It's great to be here with this wonderful panel, and I think we'll have a great conversation today. So we're not very far along on the journey. The good news is that we've begun. We've started to tackle this question of how do we make sure that more Americans and more people around the globe, quite frankly, have coverage and access to affordable medicines. But that is really just the tip of the iceberg. And unfortunately, it's a tip of the iceberg that can tilt the rest of the equation as well. And I say that because it does precious little good if all patients can afford their medications, if there are no new medications for the diseases that are plaguing them and their communities. And while you very rightly pointed to some of the amazing progress we've seen in fields like oncology, a lot of the illnesses that are presenting a huge burden of death and disability in poor minority, global communities, rural communities include things like heart disease, and obesity, and maternal and fetal medicine and outcomes. They're huge classes of medicine where we are really not seeing the progress needed to really move the needle. So even if we can make things universally across the board affordable, the cupboard is bare. The medicine cabinet is empty when it comes to solutions that are really going to help the huge number of patients waiting for solutions and cures. And so when we talk about this question of affordability, and yes, it's essential that medicines are affordable, that we also have to realize we have to have a conversation about the innovation pipeline and how we make sure that it is just as robust so that we're getting the solutions, not just for the progress we've seen in rare diseases or the progress we've seen in specialized areas like oncology, but for those chronic non-communicable diseases that are the massive front-leading killers in vulnerable communities.
And Michelle, maybe just before I get to Allan's question and chance to also talk to us about Civica and educating us more, I do want to ask you this conversation of like the tension between innovation kind of, and like, I'll say innovators' dilemmas, maybe I'll add it to investors and innovators' dilemma, because to innovate requires a significant amount of investment. And then what I think is perceived as like sitting on the opposite end is this desire to really think about drugs and cost and pricing. I don't believe that those two have to sit on opposite ends, but what is it that's really kind of, if you can talk about like the innovation side, are you watching or seeing trends in how people are talking about either investing dollars or not investing dollars because of some uncertainty on the pricing side? It's too early, we know, with where CMS is at. They just announced the 10 drugs and just had all the manufacturers, while the legal issues are getting settled or not settled, the manufacturers have all agreed to participate, which felt like they didn't have much choice, to be candid. But what is the reality? Can you paint a picture there?
Well, every piece of legislation has its unintended consequences, and one of the things we're starting to see in the innovation community and ecosystem is as the Inflation Reduction Act takes effect, the disconnect we see between the impact it's going to have on small molecules and biologics has
Huh?
started to skew how companies are thinking about their portfolios. It doesn't make much sense for them to invest in small molecules when they have a longer time frame to have price protections in the biologic sphere. So what does that mean for the average patient sitting in rural Kentucky? Well, a small molecule, you can go to your local pharmacy, get a prescription for your small molecule, and come home and pretty much treat yourself. Biologics often require extended hospital stays or physician administration, which means that there's an access issue kind of built into biologics. And yes, people are doing a lot to lower that barrier, but there's an access barrier, and on top of a cost barrier that comes in the biologic space that is tilting the equation not in a healthy direction for right now. We also think about things like gene therapy and trying to get to solutions that are one and done. We want curative therapies, not necessarily a small molecule you take every day for 30 years, but something that can really make an impact and fully relieve the burden of disease for an individual and a family. But knowing that we are often working with skewed clinical trial populations that are very white, male, and wealthy for the most part, that we're working with gene databases that aren't representing the full diversity of the US, let alone of the globe, we do not know from where we sit today whether those new, really innovative breakthrough hospital-based therapies are actually even going to apply to the broader population. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done with the tipping of the scales that's taking place around the IRA. And, we only have to look at what happened in the wake of the Orphan Drug Act to see the type of impact this type of legislation can have. When we were sitting here, if we were having this conversation 30 years ago, and we're talking about the severe need for new therapies in the rare disease space, there was nothing in the pipeline. It made absolutely no sense for companies to invest what was needed to get across the finish line for what the return was going to be on the other side. And coming together in that legislation to do things like extend patent life to reduce the burden of navigating the FDA towards approval has completely reversed the trend. So now, as you look across, the top 10 grossing drugs, top 20 grossing drugs actually over the last 20 years, the percentage of them that are affecting rare diseases has shot up. And now those top 20 drugs apply to tenfold fewer Americans than their counterparts 20 years ago. So we are treating fewer and fewer patients with our more and more innovative drugs. And that's because of policy decisions we made for good reasons, but with unintended consequences. And so we have to try to have that forward-looking scope from where we sit today to say, okay, how can we anticipate the unintended consequences of the IRA, where it's coming from a good place and a good goal, but it's going to have some ripple down effects that I don't think we're prepared today to deal with.
Very well said. And you're right. And by the way, I feel like every job I've ever had, we've talked about the Orphan Drug Act and hadn't made the modifications necessary to the Orphan Drug Act to kind of, I would say, modernize it, bring it up to speed. And so it's a very, very important analogy that doesn't get discussed enough. So, all right, we have a lot, I think, that all of our panelists could dive into responding to that. But maybe Allan, if you don't mind, Allan, tell us more. So I'm a big fan of Civica. Kevin might talk about some of the research he had done kind of earlier on pre-Civica, around Civica's inception. But I know, Allan, you've also sat at the forefront kind of at the time and thinking about why did some of these health systems kind of come together, but educate us a little bit more about Civica. And then tell me, at least when I was sitting kind of in a health system and thinking about how important Civica was, it was, by the way, when we were experiencing shortages pre-pandemic, we were having, we had shortages of like saline solution and some very like critical drugs that I think didn't make any sense to me as a clinician and policy person. But Allan, you've now been kind of leading some of Civica's efforts for several years, but have this rich health policy context from which you came. So explain a little bit more to us about Civica and just give, if you don't mind, an assessment of where we are in kind of the provision, the transactions of how we're getting drugs and important supplies into like clinical delivery settings in patients' hands, and what more we need to do.
Well, thank you. That's a great question to start with, and I'm glad to be with you and with Michelle and Kevin today. Civica is an organization that was started, as you say, around a specific problem, which is that for more than a decade, well over a decade now, the generic industry hasn't been able to reliably deliver dozens or even hundreds of essential medicines at any given time. There are hundreds of drugs on FDA's drug shortage list. So a little over 5 years ago, a group of health systems and 3 philanthropies came together, and they said, clearly, this market is not self-correcting. And so if we want a different outcome, we have to do something differently. And so they created Civica as a nonprofit generic drug company with a mission specifically around preventing and mitigating drug shortages. And so that leads us to deliver drugs in ways that are a little bit different from the conventional model. And I won't go into all of the detail here, but it starts with the selection process. So every drug that we bring to market is one that has been chosen by a committee of physicians and pharmacists from Civica member health systems. And we do have a membership model. Right now we have 55 health systems who are members, accounting for 1,500 hospitals. So a pretty good share of the beds in the country now. And then we do a number of things to ensure stability of supply, build a buffer inventory, stabilize pricing, and really stabilize the sort of demand and supply equation so that we can keep supplying even if somebody else in the market making the same product drops out of the market. So 5 years on, we're delivering 80 drugs now. We've delivered more than 140 million vials of sterile injectable drugs to our hospital members. And there was actually just a nice peer-reviewed study published in NEJM Catalyst a couple of weeks ago that looked at the Civica model. And the key takeaways there were, number one, Civica was able to supply much more reliably than the traditional wholesale model. And two, over time, Civica was net cost saving, which is not to say that we're the lowest price at any particular point in time, but when a drug goes into shortage and hospitals have to go on to the open market and source outside of the GPO contracts and so on, they're paying much more. And over time, there were savings associated with Civica. So that's the mission around mitigating drug shortages. But as we've been on this journey, people came to us and said, oh, you're a nonprofit pharmaceutical company. Can you do something about price?
Right.
And so here we just have to take a quick aside and say that this conversation requires us to hold 2 ideas in our minds simultaneously, which is that some drugs are too expensive, but some drugs are too cheap. So the root cause of shortages, everybody who's looked at it has come to the conclusion that if generic injectable drugs are selling for a price that isn't sustainable, then companies will leave the market. They'll move production to low-cost environment where the quality problems are more common and FDA presence is less consistent and so on. So that's a problem for sterile injectable drugs, many of which sell for less than the price of a cup of coffee. But at the same time, we've got products on the market now, quite a lot of them, where even though they're off patent and out of exclusivity price to the consumer at the pharmacy counter remains stubbornly high. And so we created an operating unit in partnership with a group of health plans, initially 18 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, and some others have since joined, where we're still in the off-patent space, but looking at drugs where the price hasn't come down and looking at, can we turn this model to making those drugs affordable? So the first drug we launched last summer was a specialty drug. Just to give you a little sense of scale there, we can talk more about this. That's a product where a typical Medicare month's reimbursement, month supply is about $3,200. Our selling price for that drug is $160. It turns out actually getting to that to the patient has some challenges, and maybe we can talk a little more about that. But we have a number of other drugs in the pipeline for CivicaScript, and we're developing the 3 insulins that account for most insulin use in the US, biosimilar versions of Lantus, Timolog, and Novolog, and we will make those available again at one low and transparent price. And part of the model here is radical transparency. We're saying right up front, nobody should ever have to pay more than $30 for a vial of insulin or $55 for 5 pens. And so we won't have the high list prices and rebates that kind of distort the market and end up having uninsured and underinsured folks in particular pay really high out-of-pocket costs. So that is a quick overview of the Civica and CivicaScript model.
And Allan, just to be clear, are the products, like whether it's Civica, kind of original Civica, CivicaScript, are those limited in availability to just the member organizations and plans, or is it then kind of democratized beyond that?
So the Civica drugs to prevent shortages are available only to our member hospitals. And the reason is part of the way we're bringing stability to the market is the hospitals make a long-term purchase commitment. And that enables us actually to build up a 6-month reserve inventory of drug, which we can only do if we know how much we're going to sell. So we carry that buffer inventory. And then if there's a surge in demand, like we saw at the start of COVID, when some of the use of those drugs went up 300% overnight, we were able to keep supplying because we have that buffer inventory. On the retail side, it's a bit different. And we will provide those drugs to any pharmacy as long as they agree to abide by our maximum recommended price, where we're saying nobody should ever pay more than X dollars for a drug.
Okay. And the decision on how to set the price for the X dollars, let's say it's insulin, for example, since you spoke about it, how does that get set?
So we sell at what is for us the lowest sustainable cost, and then we factor in what we think is a fair margin to allow other entities in the supply chain to make a profit, because they have to. So there's a fair pharmacy dispensing fee that's built into that maximum recommended cost.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. That's incredibly helpful, and probably a lot more than people knew. I think even I had kind of not followed CivicaScript. So this is great. Thank you. And we will probably dive into some of, you've raised a number of issues that we can tease apart when we have time. All right, Kevin. So Kevin, we've touched on a couple of areas where you've actually conducted research, not just in generic drug availability and pricing, but kind of competition, as well as thinking about a model like Civica, as you've thought through just the various policy solutions and seen what has been brought to market. We mentioned and touched on, both in Michelle and Allan's comments, kind of alluded to just what has happened with innovation as well as the supply chain. Tell us, because supply chain was not only just, it was viscerally and palpably kind of dealt with during the pandemic. However, there were supply chain issues kind of going into the pandemic, as Allan pointed out, with a FDA running list of kind of, essential drug shortages. And then, of course, the pandemic brought to light a number of other aspects of the supply chain. Do we just tell us, kind of, if you don't mind, framing where we are with respect to supply chain issues and some of the policy issues that we're wrestling with, or that, the Biden administration, FDA, and Congress are wrestling with? And then maybe we can also get your take on just understanding the role of potentially this drug price negotiation in Medicare with the effect on out-of-pocket costs, because I know that is somewhat of a debate. Will this kind of provisions and ability to negotiate on the price actually translate to better out-of-pocket costs to consumers? So two parts.
Great. Well, thanks. And those were great presentations by Michelle and Allan. Well, let me start with kind of how Civica came to be, which is really taking a deep dive into the economics behind what's going on in the market. And really, as Allan talked about, we in the generic drug space, we have a market that's totally focused on price, not focused on product quality, and not focused on supply chain quality. And the product quality piece, the distributors and GPOs will say, well, that's FDA's purview. But I like to say, you know, Tim Cook sources supplies in India and China just the same way other people do. But Tim never gets to quarterly report and say, well, we got a great deal on chips this semester or this quarter, but I couldn't supply any watches because, you know, they were defective. So, you know, the question overall is, how do we change the economic model so that we ask people to account for both price and quality? And Civica has done a really nice job proving, and this new paper proves, when we do that, actually, we have lower costs. You know, there was a big shortage of cisplatin this summer. We just kind of wrote about this in Health Affairs. And the interesting thing is not the shortage of cisplatin. It's the interesting thing is when you read the FDA warning letter that went to the pharmaceutical company, you wonder what's happened over the last 5 years to people who got product. When you read, you know, that basically the company poured acid over their quality documents so the FDA couldn't look at them. So what were they making and what were they giving to our cancer patients? You know, we've had pretty robust, pretty extensive recalls for contamination with carcinogens in metformin, in ARBs, ACE inhibitors. The entire supply of ranitidine was removed from the market, you know, which was the drug when we were training. So this is all this product quality issue. How do we make quality transparent? Like when you go to Amazon, you would never buy the low price product if it had 1-star rating. But that's essentially what we're doing. So that's the product quality side and the generic side. And, you know, basically most of the questions that most of the proposals around are, how do we think about balancing supply, you know, and making quality transparent, balance. You know, I don't want a good price with a stock out. I want a good price that, as Allan said, is sustainable for a manufacturer to, heaven forbid, invest in quality manufacturing. And that's why, you know, from the beginning, we said long-term contracts would provide some stability in the market, and Civica has really proven that. So I think there's a lot there. There's a lot there. One of the recurring themes is there's a lot there that's not transparent. Like,
Right.
Why are hospitals buying poor quality drugs? Hospitals are driving us to the shortages. Allan didn't talk about how many times the hospital systems went back to Civica and said, I got a good deal. I want to break my contract with you because I can save some money this quarter. Even though we know why Civica was formed and we want a stable supply. So that's the generic drug market. I want to skip forward and also talk a little bit about Michelle and Civica Script. And the link between those two is pharmaceutical benefit managers.
Right.
So Michelle said, you know, we're worried about the federal government negotiating price, which, you know, we could talk about, but I'm much more worried about the incentive structure that's created by this rebate model with PBM. So very few people looked at the economics of the generic drug market. Very few people are looking at pharmaceutical benefit managers. The size of the PBM market and what's going on in that market is unbelievable. So we looked at a series of 13 pharmaceutical companies, and they went from high 20% of net revenue as rebates in 2011 to 67% of net revenue as rebates and chargebacks in 2019. For 13 companies, that was $141 billion on $209 billion in net revenue. That's money consumers are paying at the pharmacy. that's being funneled through this dark box of a PBM. We don't know what happens to that money. Some of it gets funneled back to employers, but it never gets funneled to you at the pharmacy. And you're never told that this is going on. So,
And not to mention the kind of integration, sorry to interrupt, but that those PBMs are actually owned by, especially for some of the largest ones, by the plans. And so there's,
right.
Not only the lack of transparency, but one has to question what I get ruled by in my medical practice, which is kind of disclosure and conflict of interest and transparency. Where does that apply? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, so Allan's talking now about CivicaScript in the biosimilar market.
Mm-hmm.
And so Civica signed a deal with California to bring $30 insulin to market. And the price of insulin collapsed. It was a great response.
Yeah.
But the Lilly's drug only went to $75.
Right.
They didn't match them. They wanted to collapse the price and keep a rebate. So I think as we're looking forward, who's benefiting from the PBM? Now, the PBM, we should say, is not a fiduciary. The PBM is paid by the employer, but is also paid by the manufacturer and works for the PBM. It's at some level, Michelle, I would suggest, in response to Michelle, part of the issue is science, like the Orphan Drug Act. It pushed us in oncology. It is all part, in Medicare, it's Part B reimbursement, which has a different set of rules. But I think over the last decade, the industry's steered away from what's Part D drugs, because you can't predict a revenue stream when the PBM every year is asking for more and more rebates.
So let's bring all the panelists forward, because I think, Kevin, you're offering a good jump off point. And I think I actually feel like I've said this on some of our previous webinars with other panelists, that the dirty secret, not so dirty secret, about how policy gets done is that we all have to kind of work together and make compromises. I'm going to say the PBM, I have forever been mystified by our different attempts at pushing transparency at, we've talked about point of sale kind of at the pharmacy counter, and there are some attempts to do that. But Michelle, circling back, and you can respond to some of the points you heard, but I would really like to kind of hear your perspective on, I know you've had to sit and still do in this like kind of tough position of trying to like explain innovation, R&D, drug pricing, PBMs, and it does leave, I will say that it leaves most senators and members of Congress in the House and Senate confused. And if you step back, and there was actually like a survey of both pharmacists, community pharmacists, clinicians, as well as employer benefit management. These are the people that are actually managing the pots of money of how healthcare benefits are spent, not understanding what Kevin just alluded to with kind of how how the drug and pricing and cost and then actual finances change hands. So Michelle, how have you kind of tried to talk about this like innovation perspective with this tension of what feels like a lack of transparency and an overall distrust? Maybe I can just say it that way. People walk away and say the whole thing is broken and just, I'm wash my hands of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad Kevin raised those points, because this lack of transparency is quite literally killing us. I mean, I've had companies come to me and say, we as a leadership team and with our board really decided that we wanted to work on the affordability of our medicines, and we were stopped in the tracks by our PBM contracts. And there's such fear on the side, I will say, of manufacturers of being locked out of PBM markets. If you do not play ball the way the PBMs insist, your entire catalog of medicines can be locked out of accessibility to those patients. So, we talk about patent protections and how that can skew the market in terms of a few set of companies being able to set the price. but we are missing the elephant, if not the massive, gigantic killer whale in the room, when we're not talking about the role that PBMs are playing in that price setting. And nobody knows the full answer. There's not clarity, there's not transparency, and every other part of this equation, of the equation that results in the cost to the patient at the pharmacy counter, has much more transparency and is held much more accountable than PBMs are. And I think most in the biotech ecosystem would argue that if we want to get to a better solution, we have to make sure that that transparency is cut across the board. So I couldn't agree with Kevin more. It's essential. It's absolutely essential. I do think that this is, I think, where we get held up so often, which is we talk about affordability without talking about cost. And what we really need to focus on is what is the cost of the innovation that we as a nation expect, and how are we together going to realize investment, having a substantial enough investment to get that end result at the end of the day without burdening patients with a disproportionate amount of that cost. Affordability is independent of cost, unfortunately. We can dial down the affordability as much as we want, but it does nothing about the cost going into the final result. And unless we deal with that cost, we're going to be sitting here having the same conversation in 10, 20 years. And one of the bigger, in addition to PBMs, one of the other big drivers of that cost is the burgeoning clinical trial requirements on new medications as well, where FDA is asking for larger and larger clinical trials, and that is a huge expense, and an expense that also poses at times a risk for patients. So how can we try to bring down the cost of development and cut out middlemen that are taking huge amounts of the dollars off of the table and out of the pockets of patients?
And I'll say, just watching it's, so when I worked on the Hill, I worked on the FDA, and Allan knows this well from his time at Pew Charitable Trust, that I mean, there are many of us, myself and my former boss, Ted Kennedy included, who felt like the FDA both needed to have kind of this accelerated pathway, which certainly for oncologic drugs as well as beyond has been well utilized. But then I recall and still know that that conversation is going on today, the tension with the agency about moving too fast. So, you know, kind of moving too fast, moving too slow, balancing the tension. And I think that, you know, at the ultimate, I think all four of us are saying at the end of the day, like, it's our patients who pay the price, both literally and figuratively, because we're either kind of not bringing to market some of the drugs that could possibly have either broader indications, or even if it's more narrow indications, just have never gotten to that commercial stage, or on kind of the opposite, we've brought drugs that people have said we went too fast. There's not enough transparency about the trials that underpinned those drugs being approved. So, Allan, we could talk, I can let you take that into a number of different directions, but I would love to hear, I want you to put your, and I should have said this up top, I apologize. Each of you are speaking on your own personal behalf, not wearing the hats officially, even though I did ask Allan to explain Civica to us, but I just want to say that as a disclaimer, because Allan, I am going to ask you to, you have seen, not just from your current work at Civica, but some of the work you've done previously. I think we have been trying to do, I feel like I've had this conversation with you about PBMs and policy and the FDA 10 years ago. And yet I feel like we have not made progress. Can you point to some opportunities on the policy side that could eliminate some of the serious pain points we've just described? And or what are some things we need to be doing that we're not talking about?
Yeah. So let me actually start with a couple of things that are not on the policy side, but I think interesting and worth paying attention to.
Please do.
And first, probably our whole audience knows what a PBM is, but let me just quickly say that the PBM is the entity that the health plan, your insurer, contracts to manage the drug benefit that at a high level. So they do a bunch of things. They negotiate prices with the pharmaceutical company or rebates. They build formularies on some combination of clinical and cost grounds. And then they pay the pharmacies when the drug is dispensed. And so all of those are necessary functions. The problem, as Michelle says, comes in some of the distortions that are introduced through a very, very complex and opaque system, where there's a big box of services, and it's really hard to know where the dollars are going and how they're being used. And we have scenarios like the one I described earlier, where we know the drug is being sold for $100 and the consumer is arriving at the pharmacy and getting a bill for $3,000, right? So who's sitting between the drug manufacturer and the consumer in that story? And so that's what we have to look at. So the two interesting things, one is there are 3 PBMs that account for the lion's share of the market. But there are some really interesting newer PBM models, emerging that are much more transparent to their health plans or employer clients about what they're paying for drugs and where the dollars are going. They're still small, but promising. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting to watch is Blue Shield of California has just essentially taken its entire PBM business and said, we're going to take that black box and we're going to break it into 5 pieces. And we're going to contract for each of those pieces separately so that we know what we're paying. So a specialty drugs bucket and another bucket and another bucket. And that will give them, hopefully, the idea is the ability to sort of break apart that model and drive some transparency and drive some savings. There may be some things about Blue Shield of California that makes them more able than other health plans to do that, but still really interesting to watch. So those are non-policy things.
Well, can you actually, while you're mentioning that, do you mind talking about, I don't know if Navitus made the list on some of those PBMs, or maybe the Mark Company, or there's a lot of buzz around like some of the very transparent models. Do you mind just kind of offering an example or two?
Right. So Navitus, I'm glad you brought that up, because they are actually a Civica Script founding member and not one of the big 3 that I alluded to earlier. They're a PBM that has a model around, really separating the PBM reimbursement based on, very transparent service fees from margin and arbitrage on the drugs themselves. And there are others in that space. Mark Cuban so far is primarily a pharmacy. So essentially he is bypassing, and his model continues to evolve. So this may change, but at least initially and mostly so far, he's just bypassing the PBM. He's saying
and on generics for the most part, if I'm not mistaken.
For the most part, but they continue to execute new deals all the time. And essentially, he's going to the manufacturer, getting a low price and making it available for cash. And I think they're trying to iterate into now the employer sponsored market and so on.
Right. So you were going to shift to some of the policy prescriptions. I was looking for.
So that's harder. I guess
you saw, like, you and I have seen multiple legislative, all 4 of us have seen multiple attempts, and it falls short, with the exception of the IRA, which I will say was pretty, amazing that it happened, but that was timely. And
So sticking with the IRA for a second, one thing that I think has flown under the radar is the change in Part D design.
Yes.
So in the past, plans had an incentive to get people through the coverage phase and into the catastrophic phase of coverage as quickly as possible, where government reinsurance kicks in and the plan really paid a very small share. Under the redesign in the IRA, plans now pay a much larger share of the cost in the catastrophic phase. So once a patient, a Medicare beneficiary, gets up to a high level of aggregate spend in the year, the plan is still responsible. And so now the incentive to choose the high rebated drug with a high list price and a high pharmacy cost that would get somebody quickly into catastrophic is not as great as it used to be. So it may be a drug by drug decision, but it actually shifts now the incentive a little bit to maybe choose the lower list price drug rather than the high list price drug.
I think that there are some other things tucked in there that I will say this is incredible that and I find it interesting that out of all the discussions in the IRA, having like the cap for seniors, doing away with the donut hole basically, and finding some rationalization in giving seniors who have paid into this Medicare benefit. It didn't come out of nowhere for free.
Well,
who
actually,
paid this-
Kavita,
Yeah,
I
we didn't
want
get.
Part D, they didn't pay into.
Well, that's true. Okay, all right, fair. Although, isn't
Now,
there some element of
here's the premium. It's about
premium?
10% of the cost.
Uh-huh. All
So-
right, so you just shot my, but at least tell me, Kevin, let's shift to you. Tell me,
Sorry.
Kevin, I feel like I have been so tired of the donut hole. I knew why it existed, but kind of rationalization with having like a fixed amount of out-of-pocket costs in the Part D program, and even having that potential to kind of divide the payments into what, kind of essentially kind of monthly installments, so that you know that for whatever the tranche of drugs that you're using, 167, whatever 2,000 divided by 12 is, I actually think that's a pretty big deal. And I think that that's something that, we will have a lot of debates about drug pricing and the process that CMS is undertaking. But I think that is a very good thing that we have made and kind of rationalized those incentives. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, well, I want to generalize a little bit. So, we keep talking as if seniors paid for Medicare.
Well,
Yeah, but they pay for our Medicare hospital insurance. B and D are not funded. They're
Part A,
funded
sure.
through, they're funded through general tax revenue. So, in all of the craziness in Washington, one of the things they're talking about is the deficit. Well, Medicare is running a deficit this year of $440 billion. And it's going to 823 billion by 2030. And that's going to continue to grow. And if you include the payroll tax because for working populations, it's not like Medicare beneficiaries, any of that money was set aside. There's no money left from those people. And so all the money is coming from my son who's paying taxes.
Right.
So his payroll taxes are going to pay for someone else's Medicare. If you include that, Medicare costs 800 billion this year, going to 1.4 trillion in 2030. So, I think we got to be really careful about balancing. I mean, this, if even the debate in Washington it's silly season, obviously, but they are bringing up a legitimate issue, but the issue is entitlement spending, and they're cutting discretionary spending, which is what the taxpayers who are paying taxes are the services they need. So I've been.
What would that look like? How would that translate to a potential? What would that look like, right? If we were to get an rational policy kind of environment in DC, what would that look like?
Well, one of the things is, the people on Medicare and Social Security who vote for one of the political parties don't need the federal government to open up, and they still get their benefits. And so if in fact we stop cutting Social Security checks and they didn't get Medicare, there is no way the federal government would ever shut down.
That is definitely true.
Yeah. So I think that's
amen.
But I think we need to just be transparent about this. This money's not coming from, from the ether. And we have huge equity issues and other things, but we also have equity issues about why federal government's not supporting, daycare and pre-K education, which has greater health benefits than anything we would ever do for a Medicare beneficiary.
Or nutrition. Right.
Yeah. So, so I just think we
so in your mind, Kevin, we've kind of, I take your point. And as someone who had to work on talking about preserving Medicare Part D, since I came in to kind of government after Part D had already passed, you're right. It's not something that we should think of as like an entitlement in the true sense of the word. And so if we then tackle that on top of like growing costs, on top of what we saw with, let's just take the class of drugs around Alzheimer's, that alone, and what it was going to do to the Part B premiums, and the increase, which was averted for 2023, but now we will see kind of 2024 and beyond. So what does that mean for kind of this tension where we're going to come up with more and more innovations? They might be small molecules, follow-on biologics, they might be devices, lab tests, you name it. What does that mean?
Well, one of the things we've written about recently, this is kind of a crazy idea, but we wrote a paper where we said Medicare beneficiaries should vote on Part B premium increases.
Hmm.
So, so seniors were struggling, so it went premium increases just for the one Alzheimer's drug were $15 a month. But what's really interesting is when that drug didn't get widely used, premium only fell by $5. We already chewed up 10 of those dollars with whether it's Medicare Advantage overpayment or something else.
Something else, right?
So how do we create, heaven forbid, a budget for Medicare? And rather than through a political process, let's let seniors vote. And, if they want to pay a lot more in Part B premiums, then there's value to more spending in Part B. And, maybe as a taxpayer, I feel better about that. But if they are struggling to pay the premium and don't see value in additional spending, then why should I, as a taxpayer, pay 75% of the cost?
Pay the price, right? Yeah, I think that is a very provocative yet totally rational way to consider about it. Well, let's do this. I've gotten a couple of questions. People are very curious, kind of, I'm going to call it the king for a day question, queen for a day question, just because we'll do a very lightning round. So I know this is not going to be satisfactory for the three of you, including myself, but kind of an idea that we'd like to see getting advanced forward. I'm going to build, Kevin, I'm going to let your answer. That last answer was a very provocative one. So I'm going to just then see if I can get Michelle and Allan to think of what ideas need to kind of get out on the table, like what solutions, or even if they're old ones, that need to come forward again, whether it's around PBMs, drugs, supply chain, etc. I'm going to go ahead and I'll start and kick it off while Michelle and Allan are thinking about it. I think that there is so much that is poured into these buckets of innovation and kind of pressure on the agency, FDA. I'm still a very big fan of trying to understand how we can actually utilize something in place called the parallel review process, which CMS and FDA have been struggling. There's been a lot of I would love to see a more robust, better utilized, and I dare to say it, not coordinated FDA and CMS, but some way to actually make parallel review work. And that's a much deeper conversation than anybody who's bored I can go into. Michelle, an idea that needs to get a lot more attention, could be crazy, could be an old one that just deserves more airtime.
Well, you spend enough time in DC and you start to have policy fantasies. And
yes,
my policy fantasy is that we expand the definition of orphan diseases to include diseases for which there is a disproportionate difference in outcome between racial and ethnic groups. So if Black and Hispanic Americans are dying from heart disease 15 years on average before white Americans, that should be considered a national health crisis and treated under the same umbrella as the orphan disease. And once that difference gets resolved, the disease would drop off the list. So it would be an evolving definition that let us address health disparities with the attention that I think it deserves.
That is a very provocative one. That is great. All right, Allan, you've got the heavy lift of closing us out with an idea, old or new, something that deserves more airtime.
So many ideas, but I'm going to go back to shortages. And I remember back in 2011 or so when shortages first went through the roof, and a bunch of facilities kind of shut down all at once. And everybody said, what's going on? And the sort of general consensus was, well, it's a perfect storm, meaning implying that this will pass. And I think we have to understand that this is not a perfect storm. Drug shortages are an output of a system that is designed to produce or that is structured to produce drug shortages. And so we have to shift providers to purchasing in a way that creates a resilient supply and not just chasing the lowest cost product. Otherwise, we will be dealing with shortages, which means, of course, patients who can't get the treatment they need every day from now on.
I think that is I will say, not having given you guys much preparation, those are 3 great ideas. Mine is not as exciting, but I think that these are all ideas that deserve more airtime, and hopefully somebody listening to this will actually take one of these and run with it. That's our hope. I think all 4 of us can safely say that nobody can spend enough time on these issues, and I think if just in closing out, I want to thank each of you for not just the work you've each done to make healthcare and the system work better, but continuing to kind of advance these provocative and sometimes just old ideas that deserve a lot more attention. But we need more of this talking, thinking. And I'd say, I hate to say it, with the noise in Washington, D.C., we just need these rational conversations. So thank you to everyone. Thank you for everyone for listening, and see you next month when our next topic will probably be around some of the recent changes on the regulatory side around lab developed tests, LDTs. One of my favorite oldie but goodie topics, getting a lot more attention with some recent guidance coming out of the Food and Drug Administration. So thank you, everyone.